Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today, in a rarity, I'm going to talk about pop culture. I'm going to talk about this Blake Lively versus Baldoni controversy and why you should care. The Lost Debate audience should care. Like, wonkish, substantive political people should be paying attention to this Hollywood spat. And I think this is a story that you're probably, if you're a longtime listener, probably surprised that I'm covering this. I'm surprised that I'm covering this, and I'll get more to this as time goes on throughout this episode. But this is important for a number of reasons. Most importantly, because as somebody who tries to read and watch a lot of media, there is an asymmetry in how this is being covered. It reminds me a little bit of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard stuff, but there are key differences that I'll get to as we go through this. But in the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp situation, the left-wing media, they covered it here and there, but they weren't obsessed with it in the way the right-wing media was. In this case, there's a very similar pattern here, where the right-wing media is covering this voluminously, and as are just like non-political people on social media, whereas I'm not seeing a ton from the left-wing media. And when the left-wing and traditional media are covering this, they're doing it in kind of more general ways where they seem hesitant to have a sharp take or to help their audience weigh the two claims against each other from these two parties. So that's one reason why it's important. Number two is this is a legacy of Me Too story, and that will become clear as I go through the facts. This is also about Hollywood power, and we're talking about some of the most powerful people in Hollywood. So Blake Lively is best known for playing Serena van der Woodsen in the series Gossip Girl. Those of you old enough probably watched a lot of Gossip Girl. She is friends with Taylor Swift. She has a very powerful Hollywood husband in Ryan Reynolds. And so that's Blake Lively. Justin Baldoni is the other party here. He is an actor and director. He was on Jane the Virgin. He became famous in part for his activism. He wrote some books. And the two of them partnered for this movie. So Baldoni is the director and the co-producer of the project as part of a company called Wayfarer. But he's also he plays a leading role. He plays the male lead of this film. And Blake Lively plays the female lead of the story. And so this movie came out over the summer, and controversy started almost immediately. And I think in part because this is a book, It Ends With Us, that was like a book talk sensation, and it deals with some difficult subjects like domestic violence. And a lot of people were fans of this book and were really excited about the prospect of seeing it on film. But like any book with a big following, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of the adaptation of it. And issues came right away, I think largely around Lively to begin with, because Lively was doing these interviews, and a lot of people who were watching the movie or fans of it wanted her to use her platform to talk about domestic violence and abuse. But her promotional tour coincided with the launch of her new hair care line, Blake Brown, and her beverage company called Betty Buzz. And she initially conspicuously avoided mentioning any domestic violence. And she would post things like, grab your friends, wear your florals, and head out to see it, which is something she said in a video that was scrutinized by users on Instagram. One user wrote, wear your florals, what the F? This is another Barbie movie, so damn tone deaf. This is why we need Justin to do the marketing, Justin being Justin Baldoni. Eventually, due to some of this pressure, Lively did post about domestic violence resources. People who are closely watching this also picked up on a rift between Baldoni and the rest of the cast. So Baldoni and Lively were, during the premieres and the promotion, were virtually never seen together. They stayed away from each other on the red carpet. They sat in different theaters for the premiere. On Instagram, fans noticed that Lively and Reynolds and Hoover, who's the author of the book, unfollowed Baldoni, even though he still followed them. So clearly something was going on there. And Baldoni, on his side, in his appearances, was really on message about the domestic violence aspect and the sort of allyship that he saw that was kind of continuation of his public persona before this, which we'll get to. And I think the drama really came to a headway when Lively told a reporter on the red carpet that Ryan Reynolds, her husband, had written a key scene in the movie, which was something that Entertainment Tonight subsequently confirmed. And that seemed to be without the knowledge of Baldoni or the screenwriter. And it'll become clear that Lively was starting to make revisions to the screenplay, but I think it wasn't clear to people that Reynolds was involved. There were other reports that Lively was initially unhappy with the initial cut of the film and had commissioned a separate cut from a woman named Shane, or from a person, I don't know if it's a woman or a guy, named Shane Reed, who is the editor of Deadpool and Wolverine, which was a movie starring Ryan Reynolds. And so there was a new narrative that started to push out there, which was that Baldoni had been muscled out of the creative process for his own movie. And there's a lot of dispute about what was going on behind the scenes at this time. The narrative shifted against Lively at this point. And in particular, there was one video among many other old videos of Lively that came out on the internet that were not flattering to her, including this one exchange with a Norwegian reporter.
First of all, congrats on your little bump.
Congrats on your little bump.
What about my bump?
You've got two nice ones.
And they are kind of bumps, aren't they?
No, not bumps. The lovely lady lumps. Check it out.
Thank you. You like the movie? Are you a Woody Allen fan?
I love most of his movies, and this one was so visually amazing.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Did you guys love wearing those kind of clothes that you?
Yeah.
And working in digital.
Everyone wants to talk about the clothes, but I wonder if they would ask the men about the clothes.
I would.
I love Jesse's suits and how
that's what I'm saying. His wardrobe was beautiful.
I know.
Corey's wardrobe was gorgeous.
He's
Those
so
high-waisted pants.
He's so great.
I wish men
and
wore
sorry,
high-waisted pants like that still.
Me too.
Or the father with his tank top in
Oh,
bed.
it's so good.
It's just like
Did you
that.
catch
You could feel
the
it.
tablecloth on the light in the Italian restaurant when they eat spaghetti?
I didn't
and
notice that. No.
And so there's a lot of this, it doesn't help that Lively played kind of like a mean girl as kind of her main role, and even a lot of her subsequent roles have been kind of in that archetype. But there was a lot of really rough moments that were resurfaced. And I think depending on how you look at this, there was hey, this couple seems too perfect, let's see them fall, or they represent powerful, out-of-touch Hollywood, yada, yada. These are the narratives that are going to play out in the months ahead. But the movie did well. It had a strong box office performance. And I think if you're kind of weighing the aftermath of all of this, the narrative coming out of the summer was, hey, that was a really weird release, kind of like the Don't Worry Darling, I think was the name of the film that came out a couple years ago, where it's yeah, this is weird. People seem to not get along on this film. Blake Lively took a couple L's in public perception, but I'm not sure anybody would really be talking about it at this point or a year or two later, if not for the fact that on December 21st, the New York Times published a story that broke news that Blake Lively had filed a legal complaint against Baldoni and his production company and a host of PR agents. And here's some of the details. I'm sharing these details not because I'm saying that these are facts, but these are the facts that were alleged. It was alleged that Lively alleged that Baldoni improvised unwanted kissing on set and discussed his sex life, that he watched her topless, having her body makeup removed, that he entered her trailer uninvited while she breastfed, that he fat-shamed her by asking an on-set fitness trainer how much she weighed, and that when she complained, Baldoni set a team of reputation destroyers on her who set out to bury her. And this is in part explaining why some of these old videos resurface, is that the Lively camp claims that those were resurfacing as part of a coordinated effort, not a spontaneous online backlash against Lively. Notably, the New York Times story was written by Megan, I never know how to say her name, but Twoe, who is one of the journalists who exposed Harvey Weinstein's sexual misconduct, to put it lightly, in 2017. I have previously talked about her work in her book that she co-authored called She Said. And I would say before this incident, I had a lot of respect for Megan and her journalism. I thought that they were really thorough in some of the Me Too stuff that they did. And this article that they put out basically it has been described as a textbook Me Too tale. And that was made all the more ironic by the fact that Baldoni casts himself as a feminist ally. And he has a book called Man Enough, Undefining My Masculinity and Boys Will Be Human. And this is the blurb from that book. Writing from experience, Justin invites us to move beyond the scripts we've learned since childhood and the roles we are expected to play. He challenges men to be brave enough to be vulnerable, to be strong enough to be sensitive, to be confident enough to listen. So, whereas Weinstein was a bully and a misogynist even before all of these claims came out against him in the way that they did for Me Too, Baldoni's a little different in the sense that he kind of had a public persona as an ally. Now, when this New York Times article and the news of the pending lawsuit came out, the backlash now shifted to Baldoni at this point. So, mind you, this is December. He had projects canceled. His agency, WME, one of the two biggest agencies in Hollywood, drops him as a client, which I'll come back to, which I think is notable. WME also represents Lively and Reynolds, so it seems like they were choosing sides. And I think is also a reflection on what's called packaging, if you follow Hollywood stuff. So, like, let's say I write a script for a TV show, and I'm represented by CAA, right? So if I go to my agent at CAA, shout out to Andrew Miller, and if he sold my script, right, what happens is CAA will probably try to do what's called packaging, which means take only CAA people to work on the project, the producer, the director, the actors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's been lawsuits about this. David Simon, the creator of The Wire, hates this practice because he thinks it fleeces writers. But this whole thing is a reflection of packaging in a way, because the only reason why Blake Lively and Baldoni are probably even working together is because WME represents both of them. Was like, hey, this would be good. We'll put you all together. We'll make even more money because all down the line will be WME people, which makes it all the more notable that WME dropped Baldoni in the light of the controversy. Again, I'll come back to that. And basically what was happening was the reverse of what was happening to Lively before videos of Baldoni surfaced and people were starting to criticize him. There's one video, for example, in which it was at his wedding, in which he was giving his vows. And honestly, I watched this video this morning. I'm not sure what you could take this video and think it's weird, but I'm not sure it's reflective of anything. He said, I want to start off my vows to you with an apology. I'm sorry for all my faults, my shortcomings, for my insecurities and my ego, and for everything I've ever done or said that's hurt you, and everything I've done brought to this relationship that hasn't been pure, right? People were like criticizing that. I'm not sure exactly why that's anybody's business or why that's that important, but it's a reflection of like kind of scrutiny that this guy was getting. He had won an award from Vital Voices about his advocacy. That he was stripped of that award. He had a podcast in part where he elevated his activism with a woman named Liz Plank, and she unfollowed him and left his podcast. And Plank, along with a lot of Hollywood people, put out statements of varying degrees. In some cases, they were vague. In some cases, they explicitly sided with Blake Lively. Notably, Amber Heard declared her support for Lively after the Times published its piece. And so the backlash was swift against Baldoni. And I remember even, as somebody who read it casually, I don't read it like I would read a story that I would put on this podcast because I didn't anticipate getting to this point. I read it and I was like, oh my God, like I feel bad for like thinking anything negative of Blake Lively. She's the victim here. And part of the New York Times article centered on this crisis PR expert, Melissa Nathan, who has represented people like Johnny Depp in PR, and basically they were alleging, and they were publishing text messages between Nathan and Baldoni and people in Baldoni's camp that were unflattering and that seemed to suggest that Baldoni was like orchestrating an aggressive pushback and trying to bury Lively. And at that period of time, the write-ups were pretty damning of Baldoni. But as things happen, the pendulum swung in the other direction. So a couple of weeks later, Baldoni sued the New York Times as well as Lively and Reynolds. He sued the Times for $250 million for libel and accused the paper of accepting a self-serving narrative. And he 2 weeks later is when he dropped the Lively Reynolds suit, which he's seeking $400 million in damages. And the basics here of the lawsuit have come out in kind of little pieces at a time, in part because there's a very fraught discovery process going on from both sides. And there's not even just two sides here. There's all countersuits and the crisis PR people, and I'll talk about one particularly interesting example here in a second. But there's all kinds of discovery happening. There's court-ordered mediation that's supposed to be happening, which to me seems like it's not happening. And things are coming out one piece at a time here. And one notable piece here is that the Baldoni camp claims that the New York Times cherry-picked and in some cases altered communication and stripped it of context and deliberately spliced it together to mislead. And he says that the director, his camp says that Baldoni consistently expressed a desire to avoid harming Lively and protect the film, but also recognized the legitimate need for public relations in light of Lively's false and damaging claims. They claim that there was like a key emoji here in which there was like an upside down smiley face that implied that Baldoni and the crisis PR person actually didn't want it to get aggressive and that they had settled on a like more like positive oriented PR approach that, you know, would put Baldoni out there just talking about domestic violence, right? You could read all this if you want to. They later, the Baldoni lawyer also later accused Lively and Reynolds of bullying. And in part, the lawyer actually went on Megyn Kelly's podcast. So this lawyer, Friedman, who I think it's notable that, and this is in part why I think the political valence of this is interesting, is that they're often going on right-wing outlets to get their word out. Accused Reynolds of writing a character into the Deadpool Wolverine movie that was a mock portrayal of Baldoni. I didn't watch that movie. I have no idea whether it was or it wasn't, but this is the kind of thing in Discovery that could come out. And then, and as part of these suits, Baldoni sued Lively for defamation and extortion. Now, both Lively and Baldoni are public figures, which means defamation is a lot harder to prove. You have to basically prove actual malice, which means that Lively knew what she was saying or pushing into the public sphere was false and moved ahead anyway, and vice versa, right? The extortion part of this is interesting because Baldoni's lawyers claim that Lively and Reynolds pushed Baldoni to sign a statement during the sort of all this kind of stuff was going down, where Baldoni would take accountability for the negative press towards Lively and Reynolds. And Baldoni claims that in the process of that exchange, Lively and Reynolds told WME, who is, I guess, playing a mediator here, that the gloves will come off if he declined. And here's what the draft statement that they wanted Baldoni to sign would have said. It ends with us was a troubled production, which we take full accountability for. We are very sorry to everyone we caused upset to privately and publicly. Blake Lively, Colleen Hoover, the entire cast and crew led with professionalism every step of the way. Any negativity aimed at them is ours to own. We mutually agreed that the cast would be promoting the film separately and understood why. We hold ourselves accountable. It's not anyone's job but ours, and that's part of being man enough. We will practice what we preach. We're learning and growing from the experience, and we thank everyone for their patience as we find a better way to proceed. We're very proud of the film and welcome the welcome with open arms, how it's been received. And part of our work is to have the uncomfortable conversations for public growth. The film is doing that on screen, and we're doing that off screen. So reads like a hostage statement. Another notable excerpt from the documents have to do, and by the way, a lot of this stuff is coming out as part of a website that Baldoni released in early February, a couple weeks ago, called Timeline of Events, and has legal documents on it. Basically, what's interesting about the Baldoni approach here is that he's leaning into the disaggregated media environment, saying, hey, if the traditional outlets are going to be siding with WME and with Ryan Reynolds and with Blake Lively, and they're going to be misrepresenting me, and this is his take, right? Then I'm going to go to the disaggregated media, including conservative media, and I'm going to publish everything so I can open source it and other people can cover this, which has largely been happening. If you go on YouTube, you'll see gazillion YouTube videos, right? One interesting excerpt that has been published on the website is text exchanges between Baldoni and Reynolds that took place prior to the filming. The text messages, and I'm not going to go through them in detail here, but they generally make Baldoni look thoughtful, if not cringy, about a lot of the aspects heading into this filming, where he's like over communicating and sending paragraph-long text messages to both Reynolds and Lively. And honestly, it makes Reynolds and Lively look a little bit weird in those exchanges. Initially, there's nothing damaging really for either side other than very cringy and weird and self-indulgent text messages. Baldoni's lawyers claim Baldoni and Reynolds were basically expressing mutual respect through these text messages, which is, I think, pretty clear when you read them. They have lines like this, with Reynolds signing off saying, I'm looking forward to seeing you, and thank you for all you're doing. I happen to adore you, Justin. XO. So these are the kind of messages they're sending back and forth to each other. There's also a lot of factual stuff that you can get from these exchanges, including like their claims around Baldoni had recommended a medical expert, kind of like a mystical kind of a medical person, to Blake Lively when Blake Lively claimed to be sick. Later, Lively claimed that person was was recommended or sent to her because of her, any issues with weight from her post-pregnancy. And you could read from the context there how that happens. There's the intimacy coordinator, right, which is the kind of person in a movie who is meant to navigate difficult scenes involving sex and, any kind of intimate moments on screen. And there's a whole exchange there where Baldoni wants Lively to meet with the intimacy coordinator and she declines. And so these are all things that actually would become relevant based on some of the claims being made. And I'm going to quote from Batya Ungar-Sargon in the Free Press, who gives her take on what these communications mean. And this is what she said. She said, in their communiques, Baldoni comes off as sensitive to the point of self-effacing. Meanwhile, Lively appears to be flirty, self-regarding, and something of a bully. Lively repeatedly asked to rewrite crucial scenes of the movie. Yet when Baldoni, the director, resisted her rewrites, she made what reads like a veiled threat. If you ever get around to watching Game of Thrones, you'll appreciate that I'm Khaleesi, and like her, I happen to have a few dragons, Lively texted, according to Baldoni's timeline. My dragons also protect those I fight for, so really, we all benefit from those gorgeous monsters of mine. You will too, I can promise you, end quote. Baldoni alleges, and I'm still in Batya's piece here, Baldoni alleges that a couple of days before this text was sent, Lively had her friend Taylor Swift show up at the tail end of a meeting with him, one of Lively's dragons allegedly sent to defend her. In response to that text, Baldoni followed up with a groveling 7-minute voice note apologizing for not being more sensitive. I'm a very flawed man, he said, as my wife will attest, but I'll always apologize and then find my way back to the center. That is one thing I can assure you of. I'll give you my take on reading all these messages. Number one, it seems like Lively really wanted to be part of the revisions of the script and was pushing for that from the get-go. It seems like Lively expressed some lack of confidence in her body after a pregnancy, and she also mentioned that she was sick in different messages, and that the co-mingling of those two issues is part of like what I think has been disputed. But my reading of it was that Baldoni recommended this medical expert because of the sickness, not because of the weight issues. Baldoni, Lively said that Baldoni was ogling her while she was breastfeeding, but you can see from at least one of the text messages that Lively said, quote, "I'm just pumping in my trailer if you want to work out lines," which seems to suggest that she was comfortable having him in the trailer. Obviously, there's a lot more that's going to come out that could add to this or back up Lively's claims, but that particular exchange seems to back up Baldoni's reading of the events. Lively said that Baldoni improvised an unwanted kiss during the scene, but Baldoni's legal team released an extended cut of that video, and people are watching that like this Zapruder film. You can make up your own mind about that. I, for one, didn't see enough there to substantiate any claims, and I think when read in combined with the intimacy coordinator stuff I mentioned, I think there's a lot of not to see here going on there. And then there's this idea that Baldoni was fat shaming Blake Lively. I've talked about this a little bit. There's Baldoni claims that he had several slip discs, and his personal trainer wanted to know how much Lively weighed so that he could prepare to lift her in a scene. Ryan Reynolds apparently summoned Baldoni to his apartment and said, "How dare you fucking ask my wife her weight?" And again, let's take the worst reading of this, which is that he did ask her weight and was interested in for whatever reason. Not sure that is rising to the level of multi-gazillion-dollar lawsuits between powerful people that involves tons of discovery, right? So, I think we really zero in on the claims of the inappropriate sexual behavior and all that kind of stuff. And I would say, as of yet, my reading of all these messages do not seem to suggest any hard evidence of any of that kind of stuff. And again, there's a lot of discovery that's going to happen here. We could learn more. There has also been a video that's been circulating since all of this that just came out recently of Lively years prior to all of this, speaking at a Forbes summit about just how she goes about these kinds of projects when she's billed as an actress for a movie. Let's go to that clip.
They just wanted me to show up and look cute and stand on a little pink sticker where I'm supposed to go and say what I'm supposed to say. But I also knew that that wasn't fulfilling for me, that I wanted to be a part of the storytelling, that I wanted to be a part of the narrative, whether that be in the writing, in the costume design, in creating the character. And sometimes I had directors or producers or writers who would welcome that and invite that once they saw that I was able to offer that. And sometimes I would have people who really resented that because they were like, "We just hired you to be an actor." Yet when I went in the meetings, I would just seem like I'm just there to be the actor and ready to get the gig. I wouldn't reveal that I actually need to have authorship in order to feel fulfilled. So I think that for them, sometimes that might have felt like a rug pull because you're trying to assert yourself into something that we didn't hire you to do. And so it was a really strange position to be in because I felt like I don't want to just be an actor. I want to have more authorship. So I think that it's about knowing what I want and what I need and representing that from the outset. And if people are into that and want to collaborate with me for all I feel like I need to offer and bring to a job, then those are the people I should collaborate with. And if I see that it's people who are, whether this is in business or acting or whatever it is, where it's people who I can see that feels like that's stepping on their territory, that's not going to ultimately be a fulfilling relationship for either one of us. So I think it's about being upfront about knowing what you actually need versus just trying to get the job and then, once you're in it, sort of revealing the scope of your sort of needs to be, fulfilled.
And so I think this gets to where I am right now, which is, this is where I give my opinion, by the way. So I just want to be clear to the audience here. This is just based on my reading of the events, is that the most likely scenario based on the evidence I've seen, and again, we'll learn more, is that Lively and Reynolds are very powerful, entitled people who seem somewhat strange and out of touch, if I'm being honest, in reading all this kind of stuff. And that they are used to taking over projects no matter what their initial role is, and that they wanted to bully their way into rewriting this movie, producing this movie like they did, doing their own director's cut, and, exerting creative control over this, right? And you could read a lot of these messages where they very clearly talk about this as part of like in various contexts, own up to this sense that they are creative visionaries and should have a pretty heavy hand in projects like this, which is, I think, in some ways backed up by that Forbes video. My read is that they saw in Baldoni a mark, guy who's not nearly as powerful as them, and probably in part because of his like unique brand of softness and activism, was somebody they could probably manipulate and bully into getting what they wanted. And it seems strangely that they got most of what they wanted, which is they got their edits to their scripts. They got their director's cut. It seems like in certain cases they got things like music choices or whatever. And the movie did really well. But that in the process of all of this, the negative press came out. And what we'll learn is whether Baldoni like actually pushed that narrative or not, because you could actually believe everything I'm saying here, and that Baldoni pushed a negative narrative about Blake Lively and Reynolds. But when they saw that narrative, they were like, who is this guy to come at us, right? These are the people who compare themselves to, Game of Thrones people who explicitly over text, and they're like, we're powerful. We hang out with Taylor Swift. We're represented by WME. We own telecom companies and soccer teams, and we're going to bury this guy. And they have enough relationships in the press, like in the New York Times, that they were able to get their story out in the way that they wanted. Not a flattering situation for the Times. And we'll link in the show notes to a subsequent piece that Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times as an opinion piece, where he owns up to having a relationship with Blake Lively and compares, sort of, Baldoni's situation to Giselle Pericot. I can never say French names well, but the woman who was the victim of a heinous rape in France. And this is what Nicholas Kristof wrote. The shame lies with the rapists, not with their targets. And while what Lively faced is not the same, so I want to mention that Kristof at least says that, it's also true that on a movie set or anywhere else, the stigma and humiliation should fall on the abusers, not the abused. That's the only way forward. And it happens when people step forward and file lawsuits with painful details, end quote. You could read the Kristof piece. It's really embarrassing in light of the facts that we have today, that they would write that as a follow-on piece to an already fairly one-sided piece. And again, to be clear here, this woman was raped in France by at least 72 men on multiple occasions. So even with a graph of a sentence saying, of course, I'm not comparing it, by including that anecdote and comparison point in the article, you're by implication making that comparison point. I don't think that anecdote in that story deserves any proximity to Baldoni, even under the worst circumstances here. So I think it's rather embarrassing for the Times. Now, again, what do I think the most likely version of events is? I think it's that Lively and Reynolds tried to bully their way in here and were aggrieved when they felt like Baldoni was pushing back. What I don't know yet is whether Baldoni did push back, whether he did, through these crisis PR people, push to the surface a lot of these old videos and amplify them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, even if Lively and Reynolds prove that Baldoni did that, they have to prove that, number one, that what Baldoni was doing was false, which is hard to do when we're talking about videos, right? Because those are videos of actual things Lively said. So in order to prove defamation, you have to prove first that whatever was said is not true. And second, that he pushed an untrue narrative, knowing it was untrue, to damage her. So this is an uphill battle for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. And I think they thought, in going to the New York Times, that the story would end with WME cutting Baldoni, people like Nick Kristof and the sort of traditional legacy press type of people and Hollywood folks would bury Baldoni. We'd never hear from him again. But they weren't counting on this new modern media environment that we live in right now. And I'll get to that in 1 second, because I think that's the real story here so far. I want to mention one last piece here before I talk about the meaning of all of this, which is there's this guy named Jed Wallace, who's a Texas-based crisis PR person. He runs a firm called Street Relations Incorporated. Now, Blake Lively, in her filing in California, which is, I'm not going to go through all the legal filings here. There's filings in California and in New York and Jed Wallace filed in Texas in what I'm about to describe. But Blake Lively filed initially something short of a traditional lawsuit complaint. It was a document that laid out some of the allegations in a factual matter to a California Civil Rights Department office. And the reason why they did that was because there is a thing called the litigation privilege, which means that in the law, you're allowed to make claims in the course of litigation that are protected from defamation suits. So if I were to just go to the New York Times and say, hey, Justin Baldoni did X, Y, and Z to me, or Jed Wallace did X, Y, and Z to me, if I say something false to the New York Times, I could be sued for that if I meet the defamation standard. But if I do it in the course of litigation, it's protected, with an exception. If I were to make a filing to an office like the California Civil Rights Office, and then it's a private document, which it was at the time that Blake Lively made this filing, and with the purpose, again, not to file suit in California, but to preserve her privilege so that she can make those claims publicly. If she makes that filing and then uses that as a PR document and releases it herself to the public before it becomes public by any other means, then I no longer have the litigation privilege. Why is this relevant? Because that document found its way into the hands almost immediately of the New York Times. And if it is found that it was Blake Lively's camp that released that document to the New York Times, they no longer have the litigation privilege, which means that if they defamed or are even like found to have an actionable claim, whether it wins in court or not, of defamation against Jed Wallace, the crisis PR person who is named in that California document, then he can sue them for defamation without the litigation privilege protecting Lively. This is particularly important for two reasons. Three reasons. One is Jed Wallace is not a public person, which means that the defamation standard is much lower for what it will take for Jed Wallace to prove and win a case against Lively and Reynolds. So that's number one. Number two is the fact that the document in California was kind of sloppy, and because it was like a half-completed document, it basically makes a bunch of claims about Jed Wallace that co-mingles stuff with Baldoni, right? Like all this sort of like sexual impropriety or whatever that was alleged against Baldoni was co-mingled with the accusations against Jed Wallace. And in reading that document, it's not clear based on the context who she's talking about. Like you have to do some work to figure that out. So what Jed Wallace is claiming is that a reasonable review of that document would suggest that Jed Wallace did a whole lot of things that are very clearly he did not do. He's also claiming that he basically had nothing to do with the crisis PR for Baldoni, which is something that will be proved in discovery. So that's notable, right? Because that seems like an actionable claim if he gets this through the court and gets through the litigation privilege, which seems like he probably will, if Lively released this to the Times, which seems very likely that that's possible, right? The third reason why this is interesting is that even if Baldoni and Lively settle this, which it's probably in everybody's interest to do eventually here because this is going to be expensive and very costly reputationally for everybody around all of these people, even if they settle with each other, claims like this Jed Wallace claim are going to continue to go on. And it's not just about the monetary damages at the end of the rainbow, it's about the discovery. And this gets to like where this is going from here, which is there is going to be a trial, if this is not settled, in all likelihood, at least at the moment, scheduled for March 2026. And in the meantime, there's all kinds of motions going back and forth where both sides are basically trying to have like very aggressive discovery against each other. And there's certain things that are protected, right? Like Reynolds and Lively are married to each other. So it's going to be hard to get all those text messages between them. There are some exceptions, but It's hard to get those. But there are messages like maybe to Taylor Swift, maybe to WME, right? Like there's all kinds of stuff. Baldoni's messages to his crisis PR people. And from what I can tell, based on the text messages and emails that are going around, these are not people who are very careful about what they put in writing. And so I think a lot of people have a lot to lose, including people who are not party to the suit. So WME has a lot to lose. Taylor Swift might have something to lose. God knows who else might have something to lose. And so this is going to be really costly for a lot of people. I would say that based on everything I just said, Lively and Reynolds have more to lose than Baldoni, who, as I've described, has already basically lost his agency, lost a bunch of movie projects, lost awards. He's the more dangerous one here. He also, in my reading of the facts so far, has come out, the longer this goes, he appears to be doing better. And he has way more allies in the media. And so that's a good segue to talk about why this is meaningful. I think, number one, this is a truly modern PR story where Baldoni was going up against what would have traditionally buried somebody before, right? Like once the gatekeepers like the New York Times and WME and Hollywood actors and actresses are against you, that's usually the end of the story for you. But what he did is really smart. He put all of the information, or at least what he claims is all of the information, I'm sure more stuff will come out, online, and enlisted YouTubers and podcasters, including right-wing podcasters and YouTubers, but not only right-wing podcasters and YouTubers, to help him out. And they sure did. They've been appearing on Megyn Kelly. His lawyer, Brian Friedman, for example, went on January 8th to Megyn Kelly's podcast and described how Baldoni was mistreated at the premiere of It Ends With Us, and that they claimed that he had to sit in the basement of his own premiere and couldn't attend. The Daily Wire has been all over this. Candace Owens has been all over this. And they're pushing this as a story of like the excesses of Me Too. And there are tons of like apolitical TikTokers, YouTubers, Instagrammers who are covering this, and the overwhelming valence of the online conversation is critical of Lively and supportive of Baldoni. And so that's a modern media story. I think it's also a story about traditional media outlets. And if you're a longtime listener to this podcast, you know that I defend traditional media in large part. We critique them, but I always say they have an important place in society. I continue to believe they have an important place in society, and I don't want them to go away. But this is not a good look for them. I think at best, the Megan Twohey article in the New York Times, the best version of the story is that she was biased. That's the best version of the story. That she was biased to believe a Me Too story and just did all the things that a biased person would do in reporting that story. The worst version of that story is that she deliberately disregarded information that would have put Baldoni in a more favorable light, right? That's kind of the range. It's hard to explain anything about like the Nick Kristof style reporting, right? Which is explicitly biased. Like he writes in his opinion piece that he's friends with Blake Lively, and then he goes from 0 to 100 by comparing him to one of the most heinous rapes to come out in at least in recent memory, right? And say he's not comparing it, but as I said, basically comparing it just doesn't make people look good. It also doesn't make Sony, WME, actors, those types of people look good. As I mentioned, WME dropped their client. And this is really bad, right? So like when you're an agency, right? Hollywood agency, WME, CAA represents me. Like what you want to communicate to your people is kind of what a lawyer communicates to somebody, which is no matter what happens to you, I've got your back through the ups and downs, through the criticism and all this. I'm going to be with you no matter what. And I think if I'm an agent at WME after all this, I'm like, whoa, like if I'm going after Tom Cruise or whoever, and like he's up for grabs and I'm making a case, and CAA is making a case, if I'm CAA or maybe smaller agencies, I'm going to be like, look, like if you're choosing WME, look at these people. Like they dropped this guy without any due process and sided with the more powerful actor or actress, right? So do you really feel like you're going to be protected by this agency? So I think WME looks absolutely terrible here in this case. And what you have here is powerful Hollywood powerful Hollywood and traditional media versus basically the online ecosystem, which I've been very critical in many respects, but I think largely has done a much better job than the first side of the equation on this story from what I could tell so far. What also makes this interesting is the crisis PR angle. You get a window into how these crisis PR people work and a very delicate balance, right? Like when somebody hires you to do crisis PR, and you could see some of these crisis PR people trying to communicate, basically saying like, I can't really talk about what I'm going to do because they know that this stuff is going to show up in litigation. And so it's really hard to communicate with your client about what it is you're doing on their behalf if you have to explain it to them, knowing that it's going to show up. And I think this is going to be the kind of thing that affects how these crisis PR people operate in the future. There is very clearly a feminism and Me Too angle to this. So I'm going to read two takes. I'm going to start with Doreen St. Felix in The New Yorker, who wrote, "We're no longer in the Me Too era. The standard of believing women did not really become a standard. Stories of harassment and abuse now receive a curdled, cynical, and exhausted reception. A crop of disaster public relations experts prosper in this new environment, as do self-appointed legal experts on TikTok and other social media commentators. And so Lively's allegations against Baldoni were never going to be seen as brave, but rather as the kindling of culture war. The late 2010s genre of Me Too reportage cannot thrive on today's volatile internet. Information is misinformation and vice versa. Victims are offenders and offenders are victims. The word that comes up again and again in all the internet litigation of Lively versus Baldoni is narrative. Abuse seems to be far from anyone's mind. What matters is which side story is better suited to the politics of our time." So I'll pause there and we'll link in the show notes to that piece. But I think the New Yorker gets this wrong. Like they're basically saying that the problem is the online crowd, right? If you read that carefully, and you can read the whole piece, they go out of their way not to actually say whose like side of the story is more compelling at this moment, right? Which I can understand to an extent, but then don't end your piece by saying it's the online crowd that's the problem here. As I've said before, I think in reading this, if not for the online crowd, there would be no due process and a guy's career would be ruined, where based on the facts that we have right now, that does not seem to be warranted. And so I think that is, the New Yorker is showing its cards here. And, you know, my friend Ronan Farrow works at the New Yorker. He broke a lot of really important Me Too stories. And speculating here, got to imagine that within the New Yorker, they don't want to cross the barrier to questioning somebody's account of a Me Too situation. And I think that is dangerous when you're a journalistic entity, because your job is to question people's accounts. It doesn't mean you serve the powerful, like what was happening for Harvey Weinstein for so long, but we shouldn't let the pendulum swing so far in the other direction that we're afraid to like point out inconsistencies and evaluate evidence based on logic and common sense. So I also mentioned that would be another take here. And so here's like another way of looking at it. This is from Batya Ungar-Sargon, who I mentioned in the Free Press. She wrote, "The entire episode reveals the flaws of the Me Too movement. Believing all women are vulnerable to the predations of all men fails to account for the real-world messiness of how sexuality actually intersects with power. But it also reveals the flaws of the man-bun feminism Baldoni has personified for his entire career. He quite literally wrote the book on beta maleness, buying into the idea that masculinity itself is a crime that must be undone. Perhaps he convinced himself that women can't be bullies, but only bullied. And so he accepted Lively's takeover of the film, which is what ultimately led to the demise of their relationship." Well, so those are kind of opposite spectrum takes on all of this. I think would call measured, maybe Bhatia would call, who's been on this podcast before, call beta response to this is, my response to this is very simple, which is due process, right? There's a legal standard of due process, and then there's like a court of public opinion standard of due process, which I think should, obviously it's always never going to be as exacting as the legal standard, but I think that whenever there's a claim made of anything serious, maybe even non-serious, but particularly serious, there should be a process to weigh the different claims going on. And that's actually going on in the civil courts right now in this case, and certainly through journalistic entities. And the people who rush to judgment early to say, here are the villains and here are the heroes of the story, like Nicholas Kristof did, especially when they have a personal relationship with people involved, don't do themselves a service. We also don't do ourselves a service when there's a frame, in this case, Me Too, that we put on a set of facts and circumstances that are evolving, and we use that frame to obscure and highlight things that fit within a pre-existing narrative, right? Which is the Me Too narrative, as accepted by Megan Twohey and the New Yorker, is that we should believe all women, right? Which, Megan Twohey will say that she doesn't think that statement is helpful, but her reporting seems to implicitly accept that the balance is in favor of that standard. Whereas what I think is, you shouldn't disbelieve women. You shouldn't believe them on face. You should take allegations of anything like this seriously. But if they don't turn up what you're claiming, or if what's possible here, they actually turn up something that is unflattering to the person making the accusation that perhaps could suggest that they're manipulating the Me Too environment to try to serve some other agenda, then that's particularly bad, right? Because you're actually doing a disservice to the people who have meaningful Me Too claims. And that's a possibility. It is not a foregone conclusion, but it's a possibility based on the facts that we have. I would say a final piece here, which is, it's really depressing to see people who are very powerful and well off and seem to be like living great lives make stupid decisions like this. If Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, after the initial backlash to all this kind of stuff, would have just done nothing, they'd be in a much better situation than they are today. And I suspect, based on what I'm seeing here, that there's a strong possibility that they'll continue to drag this thing out and potentially drag a lot of their friends through a lot of this stuff. And it's just depressing, because what you get in this story is a window into how powerful people view themselves, the bubbles that they create for themselves, their seeming comfort level with pushing people around and calling in favors from powerful people to destroy people's lives. And it just makes you depressed for these people who are supposedly living at the pinnacle of human existence. Baldoni doesn't look great either in a lot of this stuff. I know he's become a hero to the online right and some figures in the internet. He certainly seems to have been, based on the facts here, been bullied around and perhaps misrepresented. But he doesn't come across as a normal person in these text messages either. It's not a crime. It's not necessarily even improper, but he just comes across as super weird in a lot of these exchanges too. And when you read these text messages and all this kind of stuff, it seems like these people live on a whole different planet, right? And I think that's why a lot of people are paying attention to this beyond the politics. It's like, well, this is a window into how weird Hollywood is and how weird powerful people are. And that certainly is one of the conclusions that I have here, regardless of your politics. Well, with that, I think that's enough on this story. I really appreciate you listening. Remember to rate, review, subscribe. We really appreciate having you send in those voicemails to 321-200-0570. Our email is lostdebate@thebranchmedia.org. You can check out our YouTube page by searching for Lost Debate on YouTube. And we'll be back in a couple of days. Thank you very much, everybody.